My name is John Papaspanos, and I'm a partner here at the Baker Bott's New York City office. I'm engaged in project finance, and my colleagues and I are extremely excited to co-host today's event with the Clean Air Task Force. So, as a private citizen and as an energy lawyer, I am very much impressed and grateful for the Clean Air Task Force's tireless efforts at the intersection of policy and science and technology to advance practical solutions to decarbonize our energy system. Now, this is very, very much an acute need in terms of our world. We've seen in 2023, there were 23 catastrophic events that occurred around the world that caused more than $1 billion in damages. So not only is it an economic cost, climate change, but also it's a humanitarian catastrophe, and we've seen it in various places all over the world, most recently Greece, Libya, but also it's an issue that we are compelled as a moral matter to be able to confront this climate change issues. It's the right thing to do. And with that, we're very much committed to the cause just as equally as the Clean Air Task Force. And as I see this audience today, we've gathered representatives from the private sector, the public sector, and the nonprofit sector, all coming together, like-minded. Every morning when they wake up, they're dedicated, committed to very much the similar goals of making our planet more clean and less carbon intensive. And it is a microcosm of what is occurring in the broader New York City area this week with Climate Week and the UN General Assembly convening. And with that, we're very much excited to kickstart things. I promise to be brief. And with that, I would like to introduce the moderators and the speakers to take their seats at the first row, and we can begin. Welcome again, and I hope you enjoy today's events. Sure. I'm sorry? I'll just introduce Brad. Perfect. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Baker and Botts. I'm Ben Longstreth. I direct the carbon capture program at the Clean Air Task Force, and completely second all of what you've heard about the importance of tackling climate change. I'm here to get Brad Crabtree on the stage. Brad Crabtree is the head of the Assistant Secretary for the Fossil Energy and Carbon Management Division at the Department of Energy. I have had the pleasure of knowing Brad for more than 10 years, and have always found him to be have a strategic acumen that is unparalleled, and moreover to care deeply about making sure that our climate solutions work for the communities and for the workers in which those solutions will happen. So I'm delighted to have Brad give you remarks today, and thank you all so much for coming.
Thanks, Ben. We have worked together a long time, and there are many people here that I've worked with for many years. In fact, I was reminiscing with Angela Anderson, who will be on the panel later. Back in 2002, I reached out to a late mutual colleague of ours, Phil Clapp, in Washington, because Dakota gasification had come online in North Dakota in 2000. They were capturing CO2 from lignite coal, nearly 3 million tons a year, and I was very excited about it because I saw a path, as a climate advocate, I saw a path to move the climate agenda in states like my own, North Dakota. And so I asked Phil, who can I talk to about this from a more of a strategy standpoint? And back then, way back in 2002, he said, well, you need to talk to the Clean Air Task Force. That was 20 years ago. And so I ended up talking to John Thompson, who is still at the Clean Air Task Force. I suspect there's a number of you in the room who know and work with John. I just thought nice to share that anecdote, and of course worked many years with the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute as well. So appreciate very much the invitation. So the focus of this event is taking stock and reviewing the past year on carbon management here in the US. Let me just say what a year it's been, what a couple of years it's been. really extraordinary. I think some of us who have been working on carbon management for a long, long time pinch ourselves and ask if is this real, because there were so many ups and downs. I'm sure I know a couple of times I almost quit, moved on to other climate-related topics that I thought might be more fruitful, and I'm sure others in the room had similar experiences. So after basically years of scientific analysis underscoring the essential role that carbon management needs to play in achieving our climate goals, we are finally witnessing the takeoff that we have rapidly growing understanding and recognition among policymakers and the public about the need for widespread deployment of carbon management technologies and infrastructure, and across a wide range of industries. The conversation has broadened as well. And thanks, we also now have a policy framework. For many, many years, in spite of all the public and media commentary to the contrary, carbon management has actually enjoyed very little public policy support, a small fraction of what other clean energy technologies have received for many years. And thanks to the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, that has fundamentally changed. Going forward, carbon management enjoys some of the same types of policy incentives, federal funding, federal financing that other technologies have long benefited from. And that's very exciting. So I'll talk about the year from that standpoint. Also, however, in the spirit of taking stock, this year especially has revealed a number of emerging risks in our collective work together, risks to the pace and scale of deployment of carbon management projects. They could really undermine our potential to, our ability to achieve the full potential of the legislation that we have, and ultimately we could fall short of our climate targets. But before I do that, I was asked by the organizers, as I look across the room, I see a lot of familiar faces, but there may be some in the audience that are new to carbon management. So I'm going to just give, I hope, is a pithy 101 on carbon management and what it is. So first of all, carbon management spans an entire value chain and range of activities that enable us to manage carbon emissions at large scale and prevent their release into the atmosphere, and increasingly in the future allow us to remove CO2 directly from the atmosphere that is the result of historic emissions. This value chain includes capturing CO2 emissions from existing industrial facilities and power plants, again directly from ambient air, transporting that CO2 by pipeline, ship, barge, or rail to where it can be safely and permanently stored in geologic formations. And in some instances, increasingly, those captured carbon emissions can and will be used as an industrial feedstock and converted into low and zero carbon fuels, chemicals, advanced materials, and building products. And many of you have heard this from me before for many years, but carbon capture is not new. We have been doing this successfully, effectively at large scale for decades. In fact, the first large scale project started in 1972 in West Texas. Second, carbon capture has been successfully demonstrated across multiple industries, as well as the geologic storage, trapping carbon dioxide permanently underground in saline aquifers, mature oil and gas fields, and increasingly in basalt rock formations. In fact, as you will find in the Global CCS annual report, there's been over 250 million tons of CO2 geologically stored around the world with measurement, monitoring, reporting, and verification. So it's already a large-scale human activity by any measure, and again, a successful one. And that's the other key point. Carbon capture works. Despite all the attention in the media, how the projects have failed and this and that, we have 13 commercial scale operating carbon capture projects in the U.S. They're in fertilizer, ethanol, and hydrogen production, gas processing, coal gasification, and power generation. And more industries to come overseas. There are other industries like steel production that have carbon capture deployed at commercial scale. There are around 40 commercial scale carbon capture projects operating globally. The Global CCS Institute annual report's a great resource if you want to learn more. I would just note that that's not enough from a climate standpoint, but it's a lot from a technology standpoint. We know how to do this. And I just talked to Ben and team before before the start of this session because I've been going around the country and the world for the better part of a year saying that there have been over 100 carbon management projects publicly announced in the United States. I was wrong about that. The CATF CCUS tracker is continually updated, and we're now nearly 190 projects here in the U.S. And there are many more that have not yet been announced that are in various stages of development. My final point in this sort of 101 is that carbon management's not optional. We know from analysis by the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the International Energy Agency, that large-scale carbon management, deployment of carbon management is essential to achieve net zero emissions. Climate models synthesized in the latest IPCC report show there are no scenarios where the world could keep global temperatures below a rise of 1.5 degrees Celsius without a significant deployment of carbon management. And here's the key part. Together with greatly accelerated build-out of renewables, ending net deforestation, tackling methane and other greenhouse gas emissions beyond CO2, and a number of other urgent mitigation measures. So it's not carbon management or something else. It's all the above, more and faster. The most recent IEA analysis is quite striking. It suggests that we need to achieve 1.2 gigatons of annual carbon capture and carbon dioxide removal globally by 2030 if we're to even remain on track to reaching net zero emissions by mid-century. Obviously, we've got a long ways to go, but I'm not pessimistic, and here we now get to the part of taking stock. For the first time in my adult life, and that's working for 30 years or so in some form or another on energy and climate, we now have a robust climate policy framework in the United States that's comprehensive, but also for carbon management. And the U.S. current federal effort, both governmental and the private sector, is both historic and inspiring. And as I mentioned, we have over 190 carbon management projects under development. Now, obviously, not all those projects are going to happen. In fact, a significant percentage of them may not come to fruition. But it is categorically a different state of affairs than just a few years ago. Another way of looking at the sort of a leading indicator of private sector interest and investment is the number of pending geologic storage permits. This number keeps ticking up very quickly as well, and it's a source of concern too, but I'll get to that later. Last report from EPA, when we were briefed by EPA leadership, maybe a month ago, they were just crossed 150 pending geologic storage permit applications. 150. So again, both a positive example of the interest and growth in this sector, but also a concern in terms of our ability to implement. The infrastructure legislation. We're now approaching the second anniversary of the bipartisan infrastructure law. Many of you have heard this, $12 billion over 5 years for carbon management, $20 billion if you add in hydrogen, which has a significant carbon management component to it. It's by no means the largest investment by any country to date per capita. A couple of Nordic countries beat us there, but certainly in absolute numbers, it's the largest national investment of any country in the world in carbon management. Complementing the infrastructure bill, of course, is the Inflation Reduction Act and the transformative enhancements to the 45Q tax credit. For those who are new to this, the 45Q tax credit refers to the Internal Revenue Code, and Section 45Q is the carbon capture and storage tax credit. We are already seeing literally tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars. I'm sure Anthony will speak to this later. Perhaps hundreds of billions of dollars in capital being mobilized by this tax credit. I just found out yesterday that one U.S. state, the state officials are estimating around $80 billion in project commitments already. I'm just going to give you a few examples of some of the things over the past year. Some of these you'll know about, others may be a little more obscure in terms of implementation of this legislation at the Department of Energy, and I'm going to focus on carbon management and the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, and our sister office, the Office of Clean Energy Demonstration. That's another thing the infrastructure bill did is, along with the 2020 Energy Act, it allowed DOE to expand beyond just research and development to invest significantly in commercial scale demonstration of technologies and infrastructure. And you'll see this in some of these things that have been announced. First and foremost, just here was either 2 or 3 weeks ago. At long last, we announced the regional direct air capture hubs. We have 1.5 here represented today. They were one of the 2 select successful applicants. Project in Texas, the other project is in Louisiana. As a matter of law, these projects will have to capture from ambient air and store at least 1 million tons of CO2 per year. There are commercial direct air capture projects in the world today, but the largest is 4,000 tons per year. So this is a huge step change in the commercialization and scaling of this technology. Got less attention for understandable reasons because it isn't $1.2 billion. We also announced 19 engineering and feasibility studies to seed development of future hubs all over the United States. And when I say all over the United States, I mean literally all over the United States. There is studies underway to look at hub development on Alaska Native lands from the North Slope all the way down to the Cook Inlet. We have a project or funding in Wyoming coal country. 2 projects or 3 in Southern California and 1 in Florida. So this is truly, I personally 5 years ago would not have imagined this diversity of both interest and successful applicants for carbon management projects around the country. It was historically much more of an energy and industrial state phenomenon. We'll be announcing soon $2.5 billion for commercial scale carbon capture demos, 6 of them, 2 for coal-based power generation, 2 for natural gas power, 2 for industrial facilities. And as part of that, to seed future commercial scale demos, $820 million for up to 10 carbon capture and storage pilot projects. So 1 level behind in R&D, but then hopefully coming to commercial stage later on, and this is across multiple industries. And then, very importantly, with the infrastructure legislation and the updating of our geologic storage program, which is a quarter-century old at DOE, we are now have the ambition of working with industry to support the development of 20 to 40 regional geologic storage sites. Each of those will have to capture at least 50 million tons of CO2 over a 30-year period. Some of them will capture much, much more than that. We've already awarded $240 million for 9 projects, and there's more to come. We'll be putting out a funding solicitation over the course of this 5-year period of the infrastructure bill. Region by region, we hope to support deployment. And then $100 million for FEED studies for CO2 transport, literally allowing companies and organizations to think of new ways to build out CO2 transport infrastructure, not just pipelines, but ships, barges, everything else. I'll stop there because the list gets long and I want to get to questions, but just to give you a feel for the sheer scale and diversity of what's underway. And here I want to just also recognize my colleagues, especially my career civil servant colleagues at the Department of Energy. This has not been easy. The infrastructure bill, I say this as a former advocate working on it, it's a remarkable outcome. We were all, those on the outside, we're all very excited working on it. But it's been a huge challenge we've had to retool the Department of Energy. We have staff that are literally working private sector hours, nights and weekends for public sector pay. And many of them at some of the companies in the room would gladly hire them to work on your projects, but their sense of public service, they're staying the course and working on the implementation of the infrastructure bill. So I just thought it's important to recognize them. So that's the positive side, and it is super positive. So I don't want what I'm going to say now to diminish my enthusiasm for the future of this whole sector. But there is another side, and I'll start with permitting. I think, as most of you know, permitting of geologic storage is under the purview of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And that program is called Class 6 for dedicated storage of CO2 in the subsurface. And I mentioned there's already over 150 permits pending. This is really going to test the capacity of EPA and the Office of Water and the regional offices around the country to deliver and literally doing the permits. And so fortunately, Congress saw that risk and put funding in the infrastructure bill to literally increase capacity at EPA, but also in states, so that permitting doesn't become a bottleneck. We're also doing our part at the Department of Energy. We have a partnership with EPA where we're making U.S. federal, DOE federal lab scientists and engineers available directly to work on permits and the technical and other work necessary to complete permits. But that said, the ability to meet this deployment potential, which the Clean Air Task Force and the Rhodium Group estimated between the infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act, we could potentially develop up to 250 million tons of annual CO2 capture and storage capacity in the United States with the combination of the provisions in these two bills. If we cannot bring permitting of geologic storage to climate scale, we will not reach that potential. There is, I think, also in addition to building capacity at EPA, I'm excited, and we at the DOE are excited about what's happening in the states. The EPA can grant what's called delegated authority to states, so states can do the permitting, but they have to meet federal standards. And my own state of North Dakota, the state of Wyoming, have that delegated authority. Louisiana will receive it very soon. Texas has applied, Oklahoma. My recollection is that Colorado and California have declared publicly that they will be applying. There's other states. There will be more and more states coming forward willing to do this work as well, and I think that will be good for accelerating deployment. So that's permitting, and that's where we have a big responsibility at the federal level to do our part. The other concern I have, and I suspect many in the room do, is local acceptance. We are seeing pushback to carbon management projects from community leaders, local officials, farmers and ranchers. I would note that this is not in climate advocates or environmental justice advocates in the Gulf Coast alone. There's a lot of attention to that. There's a lot of concern among communities on the Gulf Coast that have borne the burden of pollution for generations, and they worry that these projects will simply perpetuate that pollution that they're experiencing. It's much bigger than that. I was just back home to my ranch in North Dakota about 3 weeks ago. I, as you might imagine, am probably the least conservative member of the neighborhood there. And that's an understatement. And I talked to my neighbors as I always do, and I would note that we're on a ridge and we have about 500 megawatts of wind within close proximity to my township. In fact, we permitted a major wind farm that involves our township. And my neighbors want no more wind energy development. They're done. Not obnoxious, they're just done. And at the same time, some of them are now organizing to oppose the CO2 pipeline that's been proposed to route from Iowa to North Dakota, where there would be CO2 would be stored geologically. I don't think many of us would have anticipated that a few years ago, that you have this broad-based political phenomenon on the ground. So we are fundamentally rethinking how we do business as a department and as the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management. We're not going to meet our own administration's climate goals nor the deployment goals in terms of the statutory obligations we have under the infrastructure bill. And so on the issue, one of the issues that's been raised a lot is pipeline safety. When I drove from my ranch to the airport in Aberdeen, South Dakota, it's about 75 miles, I counted 4 or 5 campaign signs saying, "Stop the dangerous CO2 pipelines." Well, we have 5,000 plus miles of CO2 pipelines in the United States. Some of them are very large, span multiple states, and can literally transport millions of tons of CO2 per year. There has not been one human fatality in 50 years. There is probably no other large-scale human infrastructure that has the safety record that CO2 pipelines do. There was a very significant issue that happened in Satarsha, Mississippi, where the company involved had a pipeline leak and they had not prepared local emergency responders for what to expect and how to respond. PHMSA, our agency that regulates CO2 pipelines, is undertaking a rulemaking. We are actively informing and supporting that. So we want to make sure that incidents like that never happen again. But compared to electric transmission and distribution infrastructure, natural gas pipelines, any other infrastructure, CO2 pipelines are incredibly safe. So we're communicating that information to the public. We're going to communities that may host projects, talking about the pros and cons of projects. the technical aspects of a carbon capture project, what happens with emissions beyond CO2 when you put carbon capture on an industrial facility or power plant. The reality is it also controls for some of the other emissions beyond CO2, but then there are emissions that aren't affected and aren't improved by carbon capture. We're trying to provide the best information we can to communities. The other thing we're doing is we are fundamentally revamping our funding process. And this is something that we've now effectively accomplished and are implementing. Companies that apply for funding for infrastructure bill programs must now prepare what we call a community benefits package. That includes plans for community engagement, diversity, equity, inclusion, environmental justice, and even workforce development. And the goal of all of this, obviously it's the right thing to do, and I don't want to minimize that, that's important, but it's also a prerequisite for project success. In today's world, if you want to do a large-scale project of any kind, you have to engage with communities differently. And we're trying to use our power of the purse, if you will, to support those companies and projects that are putting communities front and center so that they're delivering at the end of the day not only the emissions reductions, but the tangible economic and environmental benefits that communities deserve. So the other thing we're doing that I'll just mention is we only are putting funding into some carbon management projects for cost share, for technology demonstration, infrastructure deployment. The bulk of the projects, the 190 or so projects that are in development, are being incentivized by the 45Q tax credit. DOE is not involved in those projects. So we have launched what we're calling a responsible carbon management initiative. And the goal of that is to partner with industry and other stakeholders to elevate safety, environmental stewardship, community best practices, all those things, because collectively, with this next generation of projects under development, we have to put our best foot forward. We'll be judged by the worst projects, not the best ones. So we have the community, the Responsible Carbon Management Initiative is out in the federal record for public comment. We would welcome any feedback you have for us on how to structure that initiative. We have until September 30th to do that. So I'm actually at the end now. The only other thing I'll mention, and this is a request for assistance. Many of you who watch this issue closely may remember that during the presidential campaign, President Biden was the first presidential candidate to actually officially express support for carbon management. And he took some criticism for it, but he didn't take it off his website. He was there before he was elected. But I think many of you were hoping for a full articulation of that support, and we got it in April when President Biden at the Major Economies Forum in New York, here in New York, announced the Carbon Management Challenge. And I'm going to look at Adam here. Where's Adam? So right there, sorry, Adam. How many countries are we at now, Adam? 14. 14 countries have joined the Carbon Management Challenge. I'm very excited because we want this to be a truly global endeavor. We now have every major of the region of the world represented. We also have Brazil and Egypt as major emerging economies. I was just at the Climate Summit a week and a half ago in Nairobi and met with ministers from 6 or 7 African countries, and we're hoping that we're going to have several African countries join us as well. Adam and our colleague Noah Deitch were just in Jakarta last week, and it's not like 100% official, but we expect to have Indonesia make their membership official. So we don't know, we don't have a target of a certain number of countries, but we really want, in the context of the COP and global climate negotiations and climate policy, to have carbon management take its needed place among all the mitigation strategies that we work on collectively. So to the extent that you engage with foreign governments, we encourage you to mention the Carbon Management Challenge and make the ask, because it doesn't just have to be in an official way.
Thank you so much. Can you all hear me okay? There we go. Great. Well, first of all, thank you again, Brad Crabtree, for joining us today. I think a great introductory part of today's event. We're really excited to continue things now with a discussion with a panel here of experts. I want to get right into the discussion, so I'm actually not going to say any more than what Brad already said much more eloquently than I could about the importance of everything from to 2 years ago, to the Inflation Reduction Act 1 year ago, but these experts are really going to give us their perspective today. And as I introduce each one of you, I want you to think about and maybe give a couple sentences just reacting to Brad's comments, sort of what your main top takeaways were. Yes?
We can't hear you at all back here. I don't know if your mic's not on or not.
Let me try and move it up a little. Maybe that will be better?
Much better.
Much better? Great. Okay. So to repeat that, I'm going to introduce each of our guests today on the panel and ask them to just give us their brief takeaway from the Assistant Secretary's remarks. So, good? Okay. Keep signaling in the back if you're having any trouble hearing us. We're going to be passing mics as well. So I'm going to start first by introducing our first speaker, Tony Catone, who's a vice president at 1.5, which is an industrial scale direct air capture company. He leads a team that's responsible for the sales and marketing of carbon removal credits and other carbon products such as low carbon fuels. Prior to this role, he was the Senior Director of Strategic Development for Oxy Low Carbon Ventures, where he was responsible for the development, planning, and execution of the group's strategy. His team worked to develop business opportunities and manage investments into venture stage climate companies and led the financing of carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration projects. He has over 15 years of financial and investment, sustainability, and oil and gas industry experience. He holds a BBA from Emory University and an MBA from Columbia. So welcome, Tony, and feel free to give us your 2 minutes before I introduce our next speaker.
Want me to go now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for having me here today. 1.5, our mission is to help society reach that goal of 1.5 degrees warming and limiting it there. So how do we do that, right? What does net zero mean? It's actually a dual target, right? We have to reduce emissions 90% from our operations. At the same time, we have to be ready and prepared in 2050 to neutralize the remaining residual emissions at major scale. And so to achieve that net zero, we need to start scaling up carbon removal today so it's available for our net zero targets. If you want to go even further and talk about a 1.5 degree scenario, it's actually 3 targets you have to do. Because after you do all that, you actually have to remove stock CO2 from the atmosphere, and you do that through carbon removal. And at the scale of that, it's about 20 gigatons a year, up to that amount. So that's why we're here. We're building the first direct air capture facility at commercial scale in West Texas. That's going to be 500,000 tons of atmospheric capture. We're talking about an online date of mid-2025. So this is under construction, in process, at a scale that hasn't been seen before. So really bold actions. Brad mentioned, I think, direct air capture at 4,000 tons. So if you added up all of the direct air capture to date, this one plant is 100 times bigger than all of that. So we're going major scale. I've also been involved with point source capture projects, so reflecting on what Brad was saying, in terms of decarbonizing that 90%, point source capture is going to contribute an awful lot to that. But you have to do other things, right? You have to deploy EVs, nuclear, renewables. You have to do all the above approach. So we're also investing in those point source capture projects. What we really specialize in is in sequestration. So we can talk more about that, but I'll pass it off.
Yeah, well, let's definitely get to that in the discussion. Our second speaker on the panel today is Angela Anderson, who comes to us from World Resources Institute, where she's the Director of Industrial Innovation and Carbon Removal. She leads World Resource Institute's growing portfolio of work aimed at enabling corporations and governments to meet their net zero goals. They produce research and analysis of key technical and policy questions and convene stakeholders to enable solutions, primarily in the refining chemicals, cement, and steel sectors. They're evaluating emerging technologies to capture carbon from the air and advocating for responsible development of carbon removal at scale to counterbalance residual and historical emissions. In her career, Angela has also led the climate and energy program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. She's facilitated U.S. NGO engagement in international climate negotiations, and she founded Clear the Air, which is a national coalition to reduce pollution from power plants. So, Angela, I'd love to hear from you, your thoughts.
Thank you. It is great to be here. Really wonderful to hear Brad give us a summary of where we are, because those days of Clear the Air, we talked a lot about the potential for carbon capture and sequestration. So much has changed since then, things we couldn't predict and a few things that we could. But the biggest one was the ability to change the energy system in the US. The rise of renewables, the falling cost of renewables, those were the kinds of things that we knew once we got to scale were really going to help shake up the existing electricity system. And we're now in the point where we can, there's a lot of, how this technology gets used is really just now beginning, this technology being CCUS. We're seeing how and what the potential is, and that and how it tackles those really tough to decarbonize sectors. We really are quite encouraged by the fact that the money that is available and that is moving forward has really, I think, captured the imagination of some of those hard to decarbonize sectors, and really interested in a little bit of dialogue about how to increase the industrial sector's interest. Lot of interest in the power sector on CCS. Really, one fundamental question that I'm anxious to explore a little bit here is the fears about perpetuating the reliance on fossil fuels and CCS's potential role in doing that. How do we ease those fears? And can we agree on some of the common best uses, and can we incentivize those uses that perhaps aren't as accessible today? So anxious for the conversation and really appreciate the chance to be here.
Thank you. Finally, we have our last guest here on the panel. He's also one of our hosts for today. So thank you, Ellen Friedman. Ellen's a seasoned project finance attorney focused on energy projects here at Baker Botts. That includes renewable energy, carbon capture and storage, and renewable fuel matters. Her practice supports a wide variety of clients, including project developers and sponsors, tax and equity investors, commercial lenders, underwriters and buyers and sellers of projects, insurers, and hedge providers. Ellen has a hands-on approach to her clients in connection with transaction structure, risk assessment, due diligence, financing, M&A, and partnership and joint ventures. So Ellen, welcome.
Thank you. Welcome everybody to Baker Botts, and I'm thrilled to be here and to be partnering here with Brad Crabtree. Several years ago, pre-COVID, I actually did 45Q live event somewhat like this, and I think it was, nobody had heard of 45Q at that point. It was like 2019, and we've come a long way. It is amazing to hear how many projects are moving forward and have been announced, how many Class 6 well permits are moving forward, and Baker Botts is probably involved with a number of them, and a number of the projects that are being developed across the U.S. as well as the rest of the world. So the hard part is actually getting to the FID, and then having those projects actually work in the way that they're anticipated. But from a project finance perspective, my experience working with renewables, those are not easy projects to get done, but you have fewer risks than in a CCS project where there's project on project on project risk, and it's new and it's hard. But everybody in this room is obviously interested in trying to make this work, and I think we are going to see quite a number of these projects move forward. I think, as the gentleman mentioned, there's pre-combustion solutions, which I think are probably the low-hanging fruit, and that those projects are probably going to get done sooner than some of the more substantial post-combustion projects, or projects that involve multiple technologies. And one thing I could say is that we're seeing a lot of innovation, and people are really taking the full alphabet soup of the IRA and trying to stitch together incentives at different points in the process. And we're gonna see some really interesting new e-fuels and different types of industrial processes. So thank you, Brad, and keep up the good work.
Thanks. We have about 30 minutes for this discussion. I don't want to keep people from the end of the day gathering, where I think we're all excited to chat more with you about what's going on in the carbon capture space. But why don't we go back to Tony just to start us off. Really exciting, the announcement that Brad mentioned. You also said a little bit about in your opener. Largest direct air capture project. Tell us a little bit about what has changed with the Inflation Reduction Act. What sort of changes have happened in the costs of that technology over the past couple of years? And how is that influencing the feasibility of the carbon removal solutions that you've been working on?
Yeah, cost is always the sort of number one question that comes out when it has to do with direct air capture, because you're capturing from a dilute source, 0.04%, right? So we had that prior conversation. But the answer is it's always relative to what, right? So we're not suggesting direct air capture as a solution for the entire carbon abatement curve, right? We're suggesting that it is a valid solution for many hard to decarbonize industries. So consider a couple things here. One, say you're an airline and you need to reduce and remove your emissions. Your alternative is sustainable aviation fuel, perhaps, and the cost of that is quite high. And if you can do it through removal, which is very verifiable, measurable, then it's that an okay way to decarbonize your operation. So it's always relative to what is the alternative. We have other customers that think of it in a different way. There's some customers that have committed to reducing their emissions by certain target dates and compensating for that. They might be building data centers and using steel and cement and not able to decarbonize that value chain in time. And so an interesting way of thinking about that is something that I really gathered from Bill Gates' book. He did a calculation as to what is the cost of no growth, right, from a carbon perspective, and he did it based on COVID. Emissions only reduced 5% during COVID, and so he calculated it out. It's about $2,500 a metric ton for no growth. And so there are certain companies that think of it in that way, right? That might be the ceiling, right? And so if they're going to be growing, they think, okay, we need to come up with a measurable, verifiable way to continue to grow. The last way is what we've been talking about for point source emissions. Obviously, we've been talking about costs being higher than expected. I think probably the hidden cost here, and I think we're hitting on it as well, is the conflicts of interest across the value chain, as well as the risks between the different parts of the value chain. Sequestration might cost $15 a ton, but then when you ask them to guarantee performance at 99.9% of CO2 that's delivered, that is a different story, right? There's liquidated damages associated with that, right? And so they're going to discount that into the cost structure. It's the same thing for the emitter, right? You have to consider the emitter. They have a core business. It's cyclical, right, as well. And they're signing up to minimum volume commitments as well. So there's hidden costs across the value chain in order to make this thing financeable.
Thanks for that. Angela, I want to go to you next to build on this question, because I think that, this question of where are we going to see deployment of carbon capture, what are the industries that really stand to gain the most from some of the policies in the Inflation Reduction Act? Can you comment on that for us?
Sure. So on the industrial side, the industrial sector has been one of those sectors we haven't talked a whole lot, or as a climate community advocated around. We spent a lot of time on transportation and had a lot of innovative solutions that are coming to fore there. The same thing with the power sector. But the solutions are harder in the industrial sector, and carbon capture and storage is certainly one of those solutions that we need to get moving in that direction. This is particularly true for sectors like the cement sector, where most of their emissions is in the process of creating the cement itself. It's not coming from the power source that is powering the facility. It's actually in the chemical interaction to create the clinker to create the binder that makes the cement into concrete, or makes cement work. So we're excited about that. I think steel is another place that there's a lot of potential for carbon capture and storage. And if I could, we think direct air capture is actually a really terrific, the beginning of going beyond emission reductions and into actually beginning to remove emissions. And our hope is that we can work with companies to get their emissions down to as low as they possibly can get, using technologies like CCS, perhaps hydrogen, green hydrogen especially, and moving in that direction. And that direct air capture is that element, along with other methods of carbon removal, that allows us to begin to get at those legacy emissions, the emissions that have been around for a long time, that actually provide the vision, and granted it's a long time off, of beginning to return our climate to a safer and more livable place. So, and I think there's how we get there, what the roadmap looks like. I think there's going to be lots of collaboration, lots of lessons from these projects that are coming on board. And I think that the power sector is going to teach us some things, I think, about how CCS can work and some of these other sectors that we talked about. But it's really important that we, if we don't have the right incentives in place right now to get those cement and steel, it's chemicals especially, get those really big emitters moving in the right direction. And again, lots of great ideas, commitments, et cetera, that we're hearing. But the scale and the, I think, familiarity with the technology, the ready to move on it is not where it needs to be on the industrial side.
Brad mentioned that before the event began, we were looking at Clean Air Task Force's carbon project tracker that we have on our website. But I want to ask you, Ellen, to tell us a little bit about how you think that the changes to the 45Q tax credit, what's significant about that when it comes to these sort of the massive number of projects coming online, as Brad mentioned, almost 200. I'd love your perspective on that.
Okay, sure. So 45Q started a while ago. There was a cap on total number of metric tons. Early on, that was eliminated in the version that came out in 2018, and that started to open up the possibility of, I think, CCS on a larger scale. As it was formulated in 2018, there were very high metric ton thresholds for a particular unit to qualify. And there was not the same level of compensation per metric ton as there is today. So in the Inflation Reduction Act, there were a number of pretty significant changes. One lowered the threshold for a particular carbon capture facility to qualify. There are some. It's too noisy. Okay, sorry. Sorry about that. So there's now a much lower threshold for industrial facilities. There is a specific threshold, a little bit higher for power plants. There's a concept that ties to a base load amount. You have to be decarbonizing at least 75% of whatever the baseline concept is for your power plant emissions. There's also what we've been talking about, much higher levels per metric ton. So for EOR, it's $60 a ton, assuming that you qualify with the prevailing wage and apprenticeship rules, which we could talk about later, but that's the cost of entry for pretty much all the tax credits at this point. And there is $85 for the Class 6 wells and $120 for direct air capture. There is another part of the tax code that was added through the IRA, which 6417 and 6418, which apply to not just 45Q, but a number of other credits, which provide, in the case of 6417, direct pay from the United States government. In general, that applies if the owner of the project is a not-for-profit or electric co-op. But what's really important from a 45Q perspective is that direct pay now applies for the first 5 years of any carbon capture facility that is applying and and qualifies for 45Q. So one of the hardest things in my experience was getting tax equity investors comfortable with this new fangled tax credit and all of the risks associated with the project. They don't now have to participate for the first 5 years because the United States government is going to be there to fund 100% of those credits. Going forward, or if you'd like, with respect to 45Q or any of the other tax credits, you can also benefit from another structure, which is also much simpler, at least at this point. We believe it'll be simpler than doing tax equity partnerships. It's under the 6418, where a party that is the carbon capture owner generates 45Q credit, can then transfer and assign those credits to a third party who has tax appetite, and that party doesn't have to be an owner of the carbon capture facility, the emitter, or the party that does the sequestration. So it's a totally new opportunity for parties to lower their tax liability. And there are now regulations in place, or that have been proposed. They're going to be finalized shortly with respect to those two important new parts of the IRA. There's been regulations, issued for 45Q over time. There's final regulations. So in terms of, all the tax credits, the new vote tax credits, I mean, they're ahead than a lot of the, let's say, hydrogen tax credits. And so I think it'll be very interesting. It's easier for people to plan and to get tax opinions, et cetera, based on that because of the regulations that are now in place. I think one thing that came out in the regulations that, maybe, I don't know, maybe this is not the crowd to appreciate this, but within 45Q previously, there was an ability to transfer the tax credit from the capturing entity to the sequestration party. And then the sequestration party might be, a party that's building a large sequestration facility and seeking to gather a lot of carbon from a lot of different emitters. And they were planning to then go and sell those credits into the market, do the assignment that we talked about, or get the government pay. That is an issue under the regs. You can't, they say you can only transfer it once, and once you transfer it to the sequestration party, that party is now not necessarily able to get, let's not speak about direct pay, but the assignment is not permitted under the current draft of the regs. So that might be something that hopefully they'll change in the actual final regs, but we'll see. Anyway, I'm babbling and I don't know.
Can you remind me of the timeline on the final regs?
Oh, I'm not 100% sure on that. I mean, they came out, they gathered comments earlier in the summer, and we'll see what happens. The major thing that they did with 45Q in the IRA is to extend the deadlines for when you can take advantage of it, and it now goes out to 2033. So we're good.
Thank you. I'm going to ask 2 more questions of the whole panel, and then I'm going to open it up to you all. So I would guess in about 10 minutes or so, prepare your own questions. Looking forward to having those. So my first question for all of you is, we've talked a little bit, and Brad, mentioned a few of the challenges and barriers from his perspective to what's going on in the DAC and CCS space and what projects are facing today. But I'd like to hear from you all, how are we innovating to overcome those challenges? And, if I could please go as far as say, what kind of support beyond what's offered in, recent legislation in the US, what would be most helpful for developers going forward?
I guess I'll start, and you guys need to be tougher on me because I didn't tell you what the cost of direct air capture was in my prior answer, I realized. So let me close that up. But it's, we're very public about this, right? It's first of a kind. Our first facility is $400 to $500 per metric ton. We're already planning on our second one, which is the one that we're working with the DOE on in South Texas. So we do expect the cost structure to come down over time. It's really a matter of a couple different things: how many times you deploy the technology and how quickly you can innovate the technology. So one thing we did there was we recently announced the acquisition of the remaining shares of the technology company that we work with, Carbon Engineering. And the goal there is to work with their innovation center in Squamish, British Columbia, and be able to innovate much more quickly there. So we're very optimistic on the cost structure coming down through many rounds of deployment. We see it getting down to the $125 per metric ton range over time. To answer your question, so to set the stage for direct air capture, it is a global market. And what 45Q has done at the $180 per metric ton, that's sort of the down payment, right, for underpinning the economics. But you need customers around the world to support it with offtake, right? And so most of our customers to date actually are international. And so what's going to be critical when it comes to direct air capture global carbon markets is to be able to transfer those credits internationally. So we're sort of getting into Article 6 here, but a corresponding adjustment, whether it's to another country or for use within CORSIA, which is the regulatory framework for international aviation. That's sort of the innovation, I think, on the policy side. That's going to be important, and stuff that we're working through now.
It's a great segue for me to pitch a working paper we just put out that is looking at international governance of technological CDR and what are some of the frameworks that need to be in place at the international level to really foster both the production and the development of projects around the world, which more and more countries are beginning to ask about how do they incorporate carbon removal into their long-term strategies. And I don't know that it'll make it into the next round of NDCs, but in some places it might. I think one of the barriers that I want to really piggyback on Brad's comments here is the community acceptance part of it. And there's two kind of innovations, I think, you can speak to it in that way. It's not a technological innovation, but maybe a social one and a process one. What Brad described, what he's doing with his neighbors, is listening. And that, especially that early stage process, I think we often focus on what can we tell them to change their mind? What can we tell them to make them understand it's going to be safe? I think as we begin to work through these community the community engagement plans, having some real discussions about where you're really listening. What are their fears? What's their experience? What are they relating your project to? And how can you reassure them that things are better, things are different? And then also hearing what it is they want for their communities. We talked about the infrastructure for the new energy economy. Well, they're looking at the infrastructure that might be, bad roads in rural areas. It might be lack of good broadband. It could be schools that are crumbling, et cetera. So really understanding from the community's perspective the kinds of infrastructure they're interested in and looking for those synergies, I think is really important. And then the way that you seal that deal, essentially, there's the community benefit agreements that have been recommended by DOE. There's a variety of different ways. They've been used in lots of different fora and developments. We're looking to really collect a lot of those and figure out how they've been successful, both process and then what ends up in the written document. And I think that is going to be a really important way for us to learn to embrace this new technology and the new infrastructure we need to get the net zero world we're all working towards.
I'm gonna repeat it, yeah. What are the challenges and barriers you see for DAC and CCS, and beyond the support that we see currently in the US, what do you think needs to be offered to be helpful to developers as projects move forward?
I think the, from the way I look at projects and our clients look at projects, it's like, why am I doing this? What's the revenue? Of course, I want to decarbonize my industry. I want to build a project that's going to, be sustainable and also make money. So what are the revenue sources? And the carbon offset, or carbon credit market, let's say in the renewable space, you get RECs. They're pretty well defined. There's a value associated with them. There's no question, that you're going to create it. There's no question that you're going to be able to monetize it in the region that you're, active. There is an LCFS market. The price there varies, but like DAC actually benefits from LCFS no matter where they build their project in the entire world. But some of these other projects, it's a little unclear. I think people are anticipating that they're going to benefit from carbon credits and have that as a separate credit stream. The question about additionality keeps coming up. There's a lot more, I think, critical thinking and looking at these credits. The CFTC has just set up a task force to try to battle fraud and try to put some guardrails on an industry that has been out there, and people that have invested a lot of money, and it's not necessarily clear that they've gotten what they paid for in general. But I think building up, stacking revenue streams is going to be really important, and having clarity in terms of being able to have products that could be sold in other markets, and price transparency and some way to forecast those prices for some of these newer products, or if you break the product and the attribute apart, what the attribute pricing might be. This is a lot of hard work. A lot of different constituencies need to come together. I'm talking really broad generalities, but I know that that's part of the calculus that developers are looking at hard when they go to decide whether or not to move forward. And the tax credits are obviously part of the whole equation as well.
Well, given time, and because I can see them setting up and getting ready for happy hour behind us, I want to go ahead and open it up to you all. So yes, we have, do we have more than one mic?
No.
We
just have the one mic, so
okay.
people have to,
we'll have to do a little bit of
outside voice saying, and we can repeat it. Like,
yeah, why don't you please stand in the back? Why don't you stand, introduce yourself, and ask your question as loudly as you can, and I'll repeat it for us.
Ethan Shankman with Arnold and Porter, DC. So, two questions, if I can. If there's not time, just answer one. So, they're primarily for Angela, but for all of you. So, first is, in terms of community concern, would you say it's more at the site of storage, people worried about leaks, the transportation, concerned about pipelines, or at the point of capture about perpetuating, certain industries? Is it, or is it all of the above? And then second, nobody today has mentioned EPA's power plants rule, which relies on carbon capture, its best system of emission reduction, which is going to spark a huge fight in the courts about whether the technology is adequately demonstrated. Do you have any thoughts about that? Do you see that as a forum in which a lot of these issues about public acceptance of the technology is going to be sort of fought out, and perhaps a court is going to say something?
So I'll just repeat, I think most folks can hear you. Thank you very much. So the first question was to say a little bit more about where some of the conflicts over CO2 infrastructure are occurring. for Angela to start with maybe, which is it at the point of capture? Is it in the transportation, or is it in the storage, or is it in all of the above that we're seeing community opposition to these projects? And the second question, the EPA announced their proposed rule for 111D and 111B on power plants in the spring that uses carbon capture technology as a best system of emissions reductions. Thank you. So that is a proposed pathway. Any thoughts about that and what that might spark in terms of community response around the country? So Angela, we can start with you.
Yeah, I think on the where is the community opposition, all of the information I have is anecdotal. I don't think that it would be quite a project to document it all, but it might be worth doing. But anecdotally, what I'm thinking is exactly what Brad said. It's not just every part of the CCS value chain where I think we're going to see some community concern or opposition. It is also on renewable facilities and transmission lines and all of those sorts of things. I think that's something we're going to have to tackle as a society, that to get where we want to go, we have to build stuff. And what does that mean, and how do you better involve the community in doing that? But I can't say for certain, but my sense is, similar to Brad's story, I just went home to Wiggins, Colorado, where they were planning a solar farm, and my mother et al. And all of our neighbors were very deeply concerned about that. And I was like, hey, that's great. So I think there's just a culture of folks really being concerned about change for one thing, and then how change is going to affect their communities, and folks are mobilized and are organizing, and so figuring out really how we turn that around so people are very excited to see new facilities coming. And there was a time, I think, in this country where people really got excited about business moving in, building new projects, et cetera. So I think we'll get there, but I think it's in some ways part of the polarization. People are very suspicious of things they don't know much about.
On the power plant rule, I mean, I know that I don't know a ton about it at this point. I think it's still in draft form. I do think that people are paying attention to it. I think they just redefined the way that they're going to be determining whether a particular power plant it comes under the jurisdiction or is going to be affected by this in terms of applying or allocating portion of the steam capability, steam turbine generation. So there's going to be a lot more power plants that are going to be affected, and if they are going to comply, if they're not going to, reduce through CCS or some sort of a blend with hydrogen to power, they're going to have to power down and not be available as much as they have been, and they provide, the base load power for a lot of the parts of the country. It's going to be an issue. So I think people are slowly, waking up to it. It's still quite a ways away. It hasn't been finalized. I do want to point out that there's a part of the IRA which is yet to take effect takes effect in 2025. That is potentially available. We'll see what the regs for this zero emission, tech neutral energy production actually means for a coal or gas-fired power plant that has a CCS or a hydrogen blend. Those regs are obviously on the back burner because there's a lot more to do before those regs take effect, but these are large plants. They don't turn on a dime. People have to plan way ahead to do whatever they're going to do. So it's real, and there's a lot of people that are going to be focusing on this as this particular regulation becomes finalized.
you want to?
Sure. I guess on your first question, you know, the person that owns the sequestration site, you know, they bear a lot of the economics, right? Because you're talking about a large piece of land, and they're being paid a royalty for the rights to the subsurface, right? And so they understand the situation, right? I've worked on a project with 2 50-mile pipelines, and over that 100 miles, it goes through 150 tracts of land. And so there's many different owners in these certain areas, and that's where you really need to get there early and be communicating the benefit to the entire community. And so I think it's probably on the pipeline, there's more pressure just because of the sheer number of people that are impacted there.
Thanks for that perspective.
While people I have one quick thing to say about the Clean Power Plan, and that's just, I think we're also, a question that is important to ask is what are the other alternatives? The power companies are, it could install CCS if that doesn't pencil out. There's, you know, a lot of other alternatives like investing more in wind, solar, geothermal, I think is getting a little bit of attention. So I think part of the rule and one of the results of the rule may be to kind of broaden the solution set and challenge companies to look more broadly at how they're going to provide power.
Thanks, Angela. I'll just offer from Clean Air Task Force, I think if you're interested in work on what's going to happen around Section 111D and 111B, we're very active in that space, and our carbon management team, and Ben, who you saw earlier in particular, is an expert and an attorney that's focused on this for a long time. It's been a tumultuous couple of decades for the power industry, but it still remains a very large portion of our emissions here in the United States. So certainly an area for lots of progress and lots of potential, and we're excited about it. Please.
Yes, this is a question really directed to Ellen. What are the project finance lenders saying, construction lenders saying about CCS? Because a construction lender is not going to lend unless they see a permanent out at COD, right? What are they saying about CCS and their willingness to finance construction finance for CCS?
You know, a lot of projects are not at that point in time yet, so I'm projecting a bit. I mean, they're looking at the credits, obviously the 45Q credits, and the different other revenue streams that need to be stacked that could pay their debt service. I mean, they're looking at technology. They're looking at insurance, backstops for a lot of different risks, you know, where there's, you know, if there's a substitute provider of a service, if somebody goes away. I mean, all of the things that, you know, as a project finance lender, they'd be concerned about. I mean, I think they're looking at smaller projects at this point and probably getting comfortable with that, but obviously, if it's a larger project, they're going to need to have some balance sheets available to support, you know, warranties if things go wrong, and you know, the normal kinds of issues that a construction lender's going to want to understand. You know, I mean, that there's nothing special. I mean, it's a new technology, and I think they're going to hire a lot of experts, you know, to get themselves comfortable with whatever it is, you know, both the capture side, you know, the emitter, whether the emitter's got a business and they could support LDs to the extent that they have, you know, an obligation to provide a minimum amount of carbon dioxide. And then also on the sequestration side, if there's any issue there, they're going to be looking to make sure that there's somebody who could provide a good LD package.
You want to say something on that?
I guess the one that surprised me here on construction loans that I hadn't seen before, and it's because the issues we're talking about, whether it's pipeline and there's no eminent domain, what they're actually expecting are subordination agreements for the mortgages that are at those tracts of land. The reason being, if there were bankruptcy at one of those tracts of land, there could be a question as to whether that bank would actually allow that pipeline to cross that piece of land. So you have to go ahead and get a high percentage of subordination agreements across all the tracts of land, which even further complicates the situation.
Well, I want to just close by thanking, first of all, again, Brad and all of our guests here and Baker Botts for hosting us. But thank you all also for being with us today. I think, my main takeaway from all the comments we've heard, including from the beginning of the event, is that there's been a lot of action on carbon capture and storage in the U.S. through legislation in the last couple of years, but it's clear we have a lot of work to do. There's a lot of challenges ahead of us, a lot of things we're going to have to overcome. But as Brad cited from multiple sources out there, carbon capture is going to be a critical part of the solution for keeping us to 1.5 and helping us continue to have a livable climate. So thank you all for your interest in the topic today. Thank you for your participation. Please join me in thanking our panel and our guests. And